morning, church, and welcome to another video Sunday morning. I'm getting a little tired of doing church like this. I am missing many of you and would like to get together again. I guess we'll see how long we have to do this, but we are here this morning and we are thankful for the technology that allows us to at least share this virtual church together. Last week, we talked about being on the altar, being living sacrifices on the altar, and we discovered that chickens do not make very good living sacrifices. But this morning, we're going to talk about butterflies and how that butterflies can help us to stay as living sacrifices on the altar. So enjoy our time together, enjoy our worship together, and I look forward to the time when we can get together and worship in the real. God bless. Last week, we unpacked Romans 12, verse 1, where Paul told us we are called to be living sacrifices. When we stood at the mercies of God overlook and saw all the mercies of God before us, we are moved to be living sacrifices. We are both priest and sacrifice. As priest, we walk up to the altar and we lay ourselves down on the altar as living sacrifices. But we observed last week that even chickens don't want to stay on the altar. The challenge we have as living sacrifices is to remain on the altar. Living sacrifices, staying on the altar, is who we're supposed to be. Now, the mercies of God motivate us to place ourselves, to offer ourselves as living sacrifices on the altar, but staying on the altar day in and day out, year in and year out, requires more tenacity. In verse 2 of Romans chapter 12, Paul gives us the tenacity we need to stay for the long term, to stay permanently, to make our home on the altar. Listen to Romans 12, verse 2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For the last, I'm going to say 7 years, Tanya and I have taught the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade class on Wednesday night. And we have used lots of different object lessons in order to teach these kids the Bible. Our kids made Genesis quilts to learn the stories of Genesis. The kids have made stop action movies about Moses. They've learned how to play dulcimers to learn the lessons of David. We've played games, we've made movies, we've painted stained glass. We've used lots of different object lessons to teach, to help the kids remember the Bible. I love to teach with object lessons. So this morning, that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to use the power of object lessons to help us to develop the tenacity we need to stay as living sacrifices on the altar. So the science behind the use of object lessons is that when we are tempted to hop off the altar, we are then reminded of these object lessons, and they can help us to stay on the altar as living sacrifices. Paul has 3 object lessons that can teach us the tenacity to stay on the altar. Let's look at object lesson number 1. Object lesson number 1 is a negative lesson. It is the cookie cutter. Romans 12 verse 2, the first part says, "Do not be conformed to this world." Now, there are 2 interesting words in this phrase, the words conformed and the word world. The word conformed is the cookie cutter. There is pressure on us to be forced into the cookie cutter of the world. The world pressures us. The world wants us to be like it. Now, I never have understood why. Why does the world care? But it does. The world wants us to be pressed into its mold. There is a constant pressure to be a cookie cutter cutout. Now, perhaps this is even stronger now in our world today than ever before, with access to most everything that's going on in the world. There's news, entertainment, fashion, attitudes, blogs, pandemics. We are being crushed into the cookie cutter. The world wants us to be molded into its image. We are pressured to be cookie cutter cutouts. I guess that would be a cookie. Now, the problem is, being a cookie cutter cutout is incompatible with being a living sacrifice. Being a living sacrifice is the opposite of being a cookie cutter cutout. You cannot do both simultaneously at the same time. Now, the other word that is interesting here in this verse is the word world. And what's interesting is that it's not from the Greek word cosmos. Now, cosmos is used about a dozen times in the letter to the Romans, and it is the typical word for world. But the word here in verse 2 is aion. We get the word eon from it. It means age or time or eternal or forever. Listen to the Young's literal translation of our portion of the verse here in Romans 12, verse 2. "And do not be conformed to this age." Well, that's interesting. The thought of age is different than the thought of world. Now, in Paul's thinking, there are 3 ages. There is the old age that began at creation and went up to the resurrection of Jesus. There is this age, which begins with the resurrection of Jesus and continues until he returns again. And then there is the age to come, which interestingly began at the resurrection and will continue into the forever. So Paul is saying not to be conformed by this age. Well, that has a different flavor. This age. Do not be conformed to this age. Now, there's some big differences in this age and the age to come. This age is obsolete. It's going to end. This age is going to die, but the age to come is eternal. This age is gripped by the fear of limitations. The age to come is limitless. This age is overshadowed by death. In the age to come, death is defeated. The cookie cutter of this age presses us into the mold with fear. Fear of failure. Fear of meaninglessness. Fear of nothingness. The cookie cutter cutout has a hard time staying on the altar as a living sacrifice because it's afraid. The cookie cutter cutout says, what if? What if this happens? What if that happens? What if? What if? What if? Oh no, I can't stay on the altar. What if? The picture here, I believe, is very graphic. If you are pressed into the cookie cutter of this age, staying on the altar is going to be hard. So Paul says, don't be pressed into the cookie cutter of this age. Well, that's the negative lesson. Now let's look at the second object lesson, is the opposite. It's the positive lesson. Object lesson number 2 is the butterfly. Now, everyone likes butterflies. I have never heard anyone say, I hate butterflies. Now, I have heard, I hate hummingbirds, but I've never heard anyone say, I hate butterflies. Now, butterflies come from caterpillars through the process of metamorphosis. Once again, listen to Young's literal translation. And be not conformed, be not pressed into the cookie cutter of this age. Instead, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Now, guess what the Greek word here for transformed is? You guessed it, metamorpho. Paul challenges us to be metamorphosized from the fear of the cookie cutter cutout into this renewed creature, this beautiful butterfly that has a different kind of thinking. In order to live on the altar day in and day out, year in and year out, we need a different sort of thinking. Now, the opposite of this age kind of thinking would be an age to come kind of thinking. Now, here is a question that maybe you can pause the video to answer. What things are going to matter in 10,000 years? When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing his praise than when we first begun. After 10,000 years, what sort of things are going to still matter? Pause the video. In this age, as caterpillars, it's hard to conceive of what the next life as a butterfly is going to be. We are certainly bound by time. We continue to age. Every time I watch the videos, I think, who's that old guy? Oh, well, that's me. It's hard to imagine agelessness. We're certainly bound in this age by suffering. Pandemics and disease and aches and hurts and bike crashes and cancer all fill us with dread. It's hard to imagine life, pure life. We're certainly bound by the actions of knuckleheads. The way people treat other people is often horrible. It's hard to imagine a world of constant kindness. But in order for us to stay on the altar, we need to renew our minds. We need to be able to think of the age to come, to think as the age to come today. Now, fortunately, there is this overlap. So the age to come is overlapped with this age, and we can begin to capture this kind of thinking. We can renew our minds to think like the age to come, and that can keep us on the altar. Object lesson 2, think like a butterfly. I suspect butterflies live fearlessly. You ever see any fear in a butterfly? One more object lesson that can give us the tenacity to stay on the altar. Object lesson number 3, a compass. Listen once again to Young's literal translation of verse 2. And be not conformed to this age, but be transformed into butterfly thinking by the renewing of your mind. For you're proving what is the will of God, the good and acceptable and perfect. Now, we all want to know the will of God for our lives. This is the big question of what is the will of God for my life? To the young, it means a career and a family and a location. To the middle age, it means finding meaning in everyday life. To the older person, it means purpose. Most of us are interested in the will of God for our lives. Now, the big questions of life are important, but perhaps not as important as the small questions of life. What? I don't know, but I suspect God is more concerned with your small questions about His will than the big questions about His will. I suspect God's will is done in your small choices. To use your gifts to help others, to express His love in acts of kindness, to have genuine relationships, to show Christ in your interactions, to overcome prejudice and hatred. The small will of God, the everyday choices of living on the altar, fits into the big will of God. I suspect God is not as concerned with your occupation as He is your vocation of living sacrifice. I suspect God is more concerned with you being a living creation than your physical location. I suspect God is more concerned with how you treat your spouse than who your spouse is. So here's where the idea of a compass for our lives, a compass that points to the will of God, can help us determine what the will of God is and can help us to stay as living sacrifices on the altar. We first resist being a cookie cutter cutout. That's not the will of God. We then begin to think like butterflies, and we think of the age to come. That begins to change the way we think. And then we have a compass that gives us direction. The compass provides us with the will of God. Now, compasses, as you know, work off of magnetic north. They point towards the north, the magnetic north. And there are lots of situations in life where there is no exact will of God. It's hard to determine the exact will of God. There's no book, chapter, and verse to tell you exactly what to do. You have to discern what to do. We need to be able to detect the will of God, so we use God's compass. Now, what is the magnetic north of God's will? There are three words in our verse: good, acceptable, and perfect. So instead of an N at the top of our compasses, there is a GAP. There's a gap. There is the good. There is the acceptable. There is the perfect will of God. So determining the will of God in a specific situation, you can ask, well, is what I'm trying to decide, is it good? Does it do good? Does it demonstrate the goodness of God? If what you're trying to decide, if what you're trying to determine the will of God is it acceptable? Now, that's the same word that's used back in verse 1, the acceptable sacrifice. The sacrifice that is without blemish. Is what I'm going to do blemishing me as a sacrifice? Is it an acceptable thing to do? And then we can ask, is it perfect? Now, the word perfect here doesn't mean without fault necessarily. It means more complete or mature. Is that what a mature Christian would do? Is it going to make me more like Christ, more complete? Does it fatten me up to be the perfect Lamb of God? These are the kind of questions we can use to determine the small will of God for our lives. Now let's pause the video and do the rubber meets the road. Let's speculate, let's imagine some situations where the compass of God's will might be helpful. What are some situations you can imagine where the compass of God's will, the GAP, might help you? Being a living sacrifice is difficult. Perhaps these three object lessons, when used together, can help you learn to stay on the altar. Don't be a cookie cutter cutout who is pressed into the thinking of this age. No, don't let fear drive you. Don't let the world drive you. Instead, develop butterfly thinking, focusing on the big picture, focusing on the age to come. And then use the compass of God's will. Ask questions like, is it a good thing? Is it an acceptable thing? Is it a perfect, maturing, complete kind of thing I'm trying to decide? Then we can learn. These three object lessons, if we can remember them, will help us to determine to stay on the altar as living sacrifices. Let's close with Romans 12, 1 and 2 from the Phillips translation. With eyes wide open to the mercies of God, I like that. Eyes wide open to the mercy overlook. I beg you, my brothers, as an act of intelligent worship, to give him your bodies as a living sacrifice, consecrated to him and acceptable by him. Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold, but let God remold your minds from within, so that you may prove in practice that the plan of God for you is good. It meets all his demands and moves towards the goal of true maturity.